Don't you hate it when you have to yawn and you can't get it up? Okay, at least if I start the show with a house advert, like, I don't know, editorial services, it kind of is a soft entry into the show. Don't you feel that it can be a jarring experience if a podcast just starts? Are we starting right now? Is this the soft open, the cold open? When will you get this right, B.O.?
So I hate writing kickers. Often file actually with like the kick with the phrase in all caps kicker TK.
Oh, hey, CNFers, this is the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, a show where I speak to badass people about the craft of telling true stories. I'm Brendan O'Meara. Do you even lift, bro? Louisa Thomas comes back to the program. Episode 430. Yeah. We recorded this months and months ago. It's kind of a theme of late, and it's a little shorty. She had a profile of Nikola Jokic, perhaps the best basketball player in the NBA champion for the Denver Nuggets. This feature came out in the New Yorker in the spring, ahead of the NBA playoffs. Long time ago now. So we talk a little bit about that, but also my fascination with how she ends a story, or ends a column. She's really, really good at it. I will add that, for whatever reason, Louisa's audio came in like unusually soft. I bumped it up as high as I could in post, but it's still pretty low. I almost killed this episode altogether because of it. There's still time, B.O. No, there isn't. We're in it. So you might just have to punch it up a bit. Punch up that volume when she's speaking and maybe dial me down a little bit. It's going to take some toggling for you, okay? It's a shorty of a podcast, so it shouldn't be too annoying. If it is, your regularly scheduled audio levels will be back next week. Show notes of this episode and more are at BrendanO'Meara.com, hey, where you'll find some new blog posts. It's kind of my internet garden, if you will. You can also subscribe to the monthly Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter, book recommendations, cool links, good vibes. First of the month, no spam. As far as I can tell, you can't beat it. You know what? And while you're at it, go to your favorite podcast app and smash that subscribe button. It costs you nothing. Maybe even have it auto-download so you can take the show on the go. What a world we live in. Louisa is one of my favorite writers. She's, anytime I go to NewYorker.com and I see her byline for her sporting scene, I'm like, okay, stop whatever. Stop the presses. Time to read Louisa's column. She has a smooth way of moving on the page. She's a staff writer for the New Yorker and an instructor at NYU. She's the author of Louisa, The Extraordinary Life of Mrs. Adams, and Mind and Matter, A Life in Math and Football, and the co-editor of Losers, Dispatches from the Other Side of the Scoreboard, which she co-edited with Mary Pallon. She's an avid runner, chess enthusiast. Come on, now she's just showing off. Tennis player. Is there nothing she can't do? She's wicked smart, and here she is. Turn up the volume, CNFers. Riff.
It's great to have the opportunity to engage with some great pieces of writing and pull them apart and put them back together. I mean, a lot of what you do on this podcast, I have to do every week now as a teacher. So that has absolutely been a gift, and that's not actually something that a writer has the opportunity to do in a sort of structure and systematic way. I mean, I think um, all writers probably have pieces, touchstones that they return to and probe and things like that. But that's sort of like, I think of an athlete like training. It's nice to get a training block in. Yeah, I think that's been great, and also just to think about the kind of constituent parts of a piece and what makes it work, and some of the stylistic things. It's been fun.
Yeah, and of late I've been talking to a lot of people, and is it about this notion of film study, and even the best athletes, the most elite athletes are they are looking and breaking down tape and defenses, and all this kind of stuff. And I think similarly, that's a metaphor that is equally applied to writing. No matter how good you are, or how whimsical or how pyrotechnic your prose might be, you still have to kind of study and break down pieces of writing that really hum, and you're like, what's making this work? And what does that degree of film study look like for you?
Not even the best athletes, I would say, especially the best athletes.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that actually that's probably something I haven't done enough throughout my career. So this is nice that I have to do it because I think when you're a writer, you get, you have your reading and things you love, but you get caught up very much in your own work. And when you read, it's sort of more for the pleasure than the plumbing. And so it's good to sort of actually treat it as as a kind of education. But I've slipped away from your question. And so you're asking me, what does it look like?
Yeah, the nature of your study. For me, just to give you a little, just to put it on a T, so to speak. Sometimes I'll take a highlighter and for instance, e.g., your Jokic profile. I took a highlighter and found where are the scenes at,
Right.
and just highlighting those out, and then you start to see the color breakdown of like, oh, here's where exposition is versus the kinetics of a scene, and that's how I like to do it with my marginalia and color coding of things. But other people have different methods, and I wonder, maybe what yours looks like.
Sure. I mean, I use a pen and underline, but I actually don't do. I certainly encourage my students to do more of that than I do it myself. When I do it, I largely just read and then reflect at the end, like how did that work, or look for a motif. You know, there's some kind of like basic things like what's the kicker, what's the lead, and how does it operate, and what are certain kind of themes that and how do they sort of draw. I'm also always interested in probably more than most people in questions of rhythm and mood and where those kind of those sort of manipulations. I tend to a lot of that probably more than structure than a lot of people. I think a lot of people, it's like structure, structure, structure. And I think that's really important. And I'm probably um, could stand to do more of that kind of picking apart, structure. But I think of pieces tend to operate, language tend to operates on all these different levels, and I like to map those things, and so I'm often alive to certain phrasing or rhythm or kind of like sentence structure strategies as opposed to just strategies of the whole piece. And one of the reasons I like actually the classroom environment is that a lot of that kind of revelation for me comes out in discussion. It's sort of fun to sort of ask a question and then answer it, not just to sort of do it on your own in the margin. That's ideal, but I like the collaborative aspect of those conversations, and you see things through other people's eyes, and even if they are pre-med students who are 19 years old who've never been in a workshop setting, everybody has something to bring to it.
Yeah, and one of the most absurd things that happened recently in the sports journalism landscape. I'm blanking on the athlete's name, but he, well, as has been a trend of late. I recorded this interview several months ago, and this thing that I'm bringing up is old news, but it's germane somewhat. The athlete's name is Patrick Beverley, an NBA player, and when an ESPN producer approached him after a game and wanted to ask him a question, he would only take questions from people who subscribed to his podcast. So that's the context of this question. And he particularly took a offense to an ESPN producer putting a microphone in his
Oh yeah,
face, and like in order for her to
platform
ask a question of him, he was
corner.
like, yeah, he was like, do you subscribe to my podcast? And I was
Right.
like, what the fuck is happening here? Like, this is
Yeah.
absurd
Yeah.
that would even be on the table, that he's only going to answer questions based on if you're a subscriber to his podcast. Like, that's just
Yeah.
absurd.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's there's a little bit of a slippery slope situation because there is a lot of access trading for interviews and things like that. that happens in sports probably as much as politics and any kind of closed world in which access matters. And it kind of indicates, there is some of that stuff that happens. People trade kind of, yeah, access for favorable coverage and favorable, podcast habits, I guess. But yeah, of course. And clearly that was seen as out of line. The team apologized. The producer and the NBA, I think, made it clear that that was clearly out of bounds. So I think that there was like pretty unanimous condemnation of that. It was absurd. But there is a kind of, I mean, that also speaks to this like larger us versus them, kind of sense of that happens in sports where the media is a little bit seen as adversarial, or there's no obligation to engage, and unless there's something in it for them.
Yeah, and a moment ago you were talking about sentences and even bringing kickers into it, and talking to your students about kickers and so forth. And there was something striking that I love about how you end a piece, but be it a column or a profile, and a lot of your final sentences, at least in the survey I've done and have just come to expect from you when I hit the end of one of your pieces, is it's extremely punchy, often fewer than 8 words. It's usually like a 5-word sentence. I love it. Like with the women's basketball column you wrote recently, your final sentence was like, it was fun to watch. Jokic. Afterward, Jokic declined to speak. Mookie Betts. It's just me too.
Right.
The recent A's column, he eventually dies of neglect. Now that those are without context, but you go for a punchy sentence at the end, and I always appreciate that. So how cognizant are you of that degree of finality in your pieces?
So I hate writing kickers. I often file actually with like the kick with the phrase in all caps, kicker TK, kicker to come,
Mm-hmm.
because I find them quite difficult, and they often come in very late. Either come to me, or my editor is really good at kickers, which is one of the reasons I rely on him when I send things in. For instance, that A's column from last weekend, I'd actually begun the second section with the metamorphosis. Actually,
Mm.
I had
Yeah.
actually tried writing that piece as a parody of the metamorphosis. Like full, I did the full thing. I mean, I actually was like Mad Libs, and I had a lot of fun with it. And then I gave it to a friend, and my friend was like, "Well, if you were able to, run this alongside the metamorphosis, it would make sense. But no, you can't do this." So then I turned it into something much more conventional, and I had that actually higher up, and I don't remember what my original kicker was. But my editor was the one who identified that as the correct way to end the piece, and he was right. So all credit to him, and often like he deserves a lot of credit. I think for we go back and forth on kickers a lot, so I feel like that's actually something he's very good at, and I'm learning from him. But yeah, a like short punchy sentence is often, yeah, it is where I want to land, because you want to come away with a bit of a punch, kind of like the reverberations of that. So that's definitely what I'm aiming for. I do think the kickers are really important. Especially in a short piece, because at the end of a long piece, you sort of trust they can be magical. I mean, just can totally reframe the whole thing for you. But also at the end of a short piece, you can actually trust that they're probably going to get there. So they're really
Mm-hmm.
important.
Yeah, and also, talking about endings there. How do you process your way into a piece, be it a column or a profile? Those entry points.
A column and a profile have different entry points often.
Yeah.
Um, but in a column, well, these days I have a weekly column, so it's all done in a very compressed time frame. I actually am not writing this week, but this is the first week I haven't written since February, I think. So my entry point to a column is often my deadline.
Right.
You just have to figure it out in a certain amount of time, and then whatever it's going to be, it's going to be. And sometimes, like I said, sometimes if you're struggling, like you just have to try to have fun with it, like the A's piece. I sort of thought that was going to be just easy, low hanging fruit, to be honest. And
Mm-hmm.
the backstory is also like my sister was getting married, so I was going to DC for her wedding, and I wanted to be like very much present, as the matron of honor and all her sister and all that stuff. So I wanted something that was sort of I was able to do, that wasn't going to give me too many fits. But it did actually, because everything gives me fits. And I couldn't sort of figure out a way to be original. And in the end, I'm not sure I was particularly original, but I just wasn't having enough fun with it because it's such a crazy story. That's how I was just kept thinking about this story. I kept thinking of the stadium. I mean, actually, what it said saying the piece is true. That stadium reminded me of this insect. The opening of the metamorphosis, and I thought, well, there was something very kind of like, sometimes with my friends, I almost like write fan fiction, about athletes. And so I just sort of playing around with that. And then I wrote this whole like 2,000 word thing. And that was a lot of fun, and it ended up not working, but that was my way into it. That was my process. And then I was able to sort of settle down and use a lot of the material that I had in that, piece, and turn it into something like readable and understandable by people who are not, scanning line by line. And sometimes it's more like I have an idea and I need to, think about, well, what's the lead, and what's the way into it and how does it develop. I don't write an outline. I
Mhm.
sometimes usually write a few notes. I have like I use Evernote. So I have a document of full of research or ideas or thoughts or interviews if I've done interviews. And then I just start writing. For a profile, I do kind of block it out a little bit more. I still don't have an outline, but I have a sort of like a beats I want to hit and general sense of structure. But the main like thing I do for my process is I do a lot of it in my head. I mean, what's sort of unusual, I guess, is that I do a lot of the planning and even pre-writing in my head.
Right.
You actually won't find it in my notes because it's in my head, and I like working that way because I'm just attendant to like feelings and sounds more when it's in my head than when it's on the page. And it's easier to sort of stop and say, well, what are you trying to get? What are you trying to do here? Whereas when it's on the page, I start fiddling with the sentences and things like that, and I can get distracted by, you know, I tend to put when I'm just writing on the page, I focus on the information less than effects, the effects of it.
Mm.
So when it's in my head, I'm more focused on the effects probably. So yeah, so my process is very mental.
Yeah.
I like to, I actually used to always do this, and now I don't so much because I have kids, and so I have less time. But I used to like to go for a run and like think through a piece. Now I do more of that process when I'm like in carpool line, or like waiting for the water to boil while I'm making pasta. But I still try to make sure that gets done, that I like actually spend a lot of time just thinking and not just like writing. That's the most important time to me.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, and yeah, with the Jokic profile, every piece begins anew. And what speaking of this one in particular, what were some things that were just a repertorial challenge for you as you were looking to synthesize the material?
Well, I knew I wasn't going to get access to him, so that kind of made that part of it easy. I
Hmm.
mean, there are challenges to not getting access, obviously. I went to Dallas, so I knew that I was going to have some of that, like that was going to make its way into the piece. What I kind of observed there, at least some of it was going to. And I had, we spent some time thinking about like, well, what can we add here? And part of this conversation was like, how does he fit into what are good comps, because he's so weird. So we were trying to, and those are partly just like born out of conversations you're having with people. And so I knew I wanted a section on that. Um, and then, there becomes this question of like, well, how can you just build them into the piece? And so the conversation I had with Walton, for instance, he was open to watching some of the game with me. So that actually made its way as like a scene, as opposed to just, Bill Walton said he doesn't remind him of himself or whatever. Yeah, I knew I wanted to begin with Jokic winning the championship because I remember watching in real time all the press conference and the the end of the game, and just like it just seemed so funny and revealing, and like so much of what made Jokic, but also more more complex than people kind of give him credit for. I had a pretty strong sense that that's how I wanted it to begin. And then a lot of it was also just like trying to really learn about this person that is not that overexposed in some sense for all sorts of reasons. But you also don't want to just kind of skate along, what's been said before. So it was fun. I also just wanted to communicate to this question of like, what do I do when I'm not writing? When I'm not on my computer, I do try to like, as I said, I try to be like, well, what am I doing? Why am I writing this? And so I spent a lot of time kind of try to answer that question. Like a lot of why I wanted to write about Jokic was I loved watching him play. Like it was just so weird and fun and beautiful and funny. And I wanted that experience to like come through in the piece. That was my main goal probably. And I wanted some of that my own interest. I wanted you to feel in the piece my own interest in watching and in his like life. And that was my main, that was my main goal. And I hope it came through. I wanted you just to like be along the ride with me.
Yeah, very nice. Well, Louisa, I want to be mindful of your time and everything. And as I bring these conversations down for a landing, I love asking the guests and writers for recommendations of some kind for the listeners out there, and that can just be anything you're excited about. It could be a book, but it could be just like a brand of coffee. You're like, this is good. So I would just extend that to you as we bring our conversation down for a landing.
Let's see. Good. I mean, I read a lot of good books. Books that I love. What are recent books that I love? I've been reading a lot of Roger Angell lately, actually.
Oh, nice.
Because I couldn't find some of mine, so I actually just bought like all of his books and have them by my desk. I mean, I read a lot for fun. I read like novels and fiction. I'm reading Alice Munro's collection. I have something to tell you right now. In light after her death, I picked it up. So I care about those books for all this. I have something to say, I guess, and something I've been meaning to tell you. That's rhythm and character, and the beats of a story. That's the kind of stuff you can get that from anywhere.
Cool, fantastic. Well, Louisa, thank you so much for carving some time and talking a little shop. And so I look forward to when we're able to do this again. But this was wonderful.
Absolutely, thank you.
All right, yes, awesome. Good darn internet. Thanks to Louisa for coming back on the show. Third trip, I believe. Make sure you're subscribing to the podcast. Smash that button. And the weekly Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter. Waiting on a final batch of edits, chapter 16 and epilogue. And I've gone through everything to date. I have to go back through and further format and notes and kind of fact check myself and maybe work up the courage to call some more people for fact checking purposes or not. I don't know. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I think I've addressed most of the notes so far. What ends up happening when I get a new batch of notes is I mainline them. I scroll through the whole file and then I hit a comment and they are universally bad. And by bad, I mean it's just a shortcoming in the manuscript that I have to address, lest the book get shredded by an astute reviewer. I picture Catherine Schultz of The New Yorker getting a hold of this book and crushing it. Like, not in a good way, just like crushing it. But what ends up happening is you mainline enough of the criticism, and it's not unlike eating an entire family-size bag of sweet chili Doritos. You feel like shit afterwards. You're like, fuck, I'm terrible at this, and nobody will read this, and Catherine Schultz is going to crush it. Then I go for a 15-minute walk out in the neighborhood, a little 3/4-mile loop, something I like to do every 60 to 90 minutes anyway. And then I return and address the first comment as best I can. But what's happening is the only notes I get are from like the weak and shitty parts that need help. There are no notes for what's good. There's no, oh, I really like what you did here, or this is a really cracking sentence. There's none of that. So in rare moments of confidence and assuredness, I remind myself, okay, if there are no notes, the assumption is that it's good. The quote bad notes are they're there to level up to the rest. At least that's the hope. At some point you realize you're better off with a coach and not a cheerleader. You know, what my brilliant, kind, and generous editor is doing is breaking out the game tape, hit and play, pause, rewind, play, pause, rewind, and saying, okay, if we're going to win, we need to make these adjustments. We need to fix this. Otherwise, we're going to get shredded by Catherine Schultz. Bill Belichick almost never complimented Tom Brady. I'm not saying that's the right thing to do. I think at some point or another, you need to be like, okay, you're doing a good job here. Here's a pat on the ass. Those two, they established that coaching was better than cheerleading to where they wanted to go. I've chosen to view the criticism through that rubric. No notes means we're not taking on negative plays. We're making progress. He probably really likes everything he's reading where he's not making a note. Notes aren't there to make me feel like shit. It's to make a possibly good book great. And that's how I have to try to reframe it in my head. No notes means we're good. A note here is a chance to level up, a chance to improve. So stay wild, CNFers. If you can't do, interview. See ya.